Bismillah ar-Rahman Rahim. We start a few new revision topics which I've been asked by many students and who find these topics difficult. So the first one is on menstrual cycle, and the next one is going to be on the nitrogen cycle and then the carbon cycle. So a few new revision videos for you all to improve your concepts of these topics in the chapters. Now, first thing which you need to understand is the menstrual cycle is what? The menstrual cycle is a 28-day cycle, and you can very easily divide it into this phase, which is the menstruation phase, and then we have this phase in which the lining repairs, and then the lining remains thickened, and day 14 you have to understand there is ovulation. So let's divide it into a few compartments, and then let's go and understand the different phases of the menstrual cycle. If you divide it into, I'm going to give you 2 or 3 ways to how to remember it. So please go through the whole video and listen to me, and then of course you can figure it out. But please pause the video and make your notes as you go along. Now first let's look at the basic structure of the whole female reproductive system. So there is an organ called the uterus, and this uterus has a wall, and then it has a lining. That lining is called the endometrium. So this is the lining, this is the lining here, this is the lining here. We're not talking of the wall, this is the lining. This is the wall of the uterus, which is made up of muscle actually, because the muscle is going to contract and relax to push the baby out at birth. Then we have another organ which is called the ovary. And you see the ovary is not sort of floating in the abdominal cavity, and you can see it is in the lower part of the pelvis where the uterus and the ovary, and the ovary is attached to something. It can't be just there. There has to be an ovarian artery, there is an ovarian vein. So every organ of the body has an artery and a vein because it has to have a blood supply, because the glucose and oxygen has to be carried to the cells. The cells are all living. They need to respire to release energy. And a lot of activity is taking place there. Then we have another which we have to understand is the ovary and then the oviduct or the fallopian tubes. Now, from here to here, this is all the oviduct, and there will be two oviducts, one on this side and one on the other side. So the oviduct, or the other word for it, is the fallopian tube. The uterus, then this part of the uterus, which is called the cervix, and it has a ring of muscle here which actually keeps it closed when the fetus is developing inside the uterus. So uterus, wall of the uterus made of muscle, then the lining of the uterus, which is got a very specific name called the endometrium. Just like the lining of the blood vessels of the capillary is called endothelium. Endo means anything internal. In the heart, we have a part which is called the endocardium. So what we have to understand is endothelium was the inner lining of the blood vessels. Forget this at the moment. Endometrium is the lining of the uterus. And this lining is shed. Please don't say the wall is shed. The wall is never shed. The wall can't be shed, otherwise the uterus would be shed. So what we have to understand is uterus, cervix, the opening, oviduct or the fallopian tube, one on either side, and the important organ which is called the ovary. Now let's look at the function of the ovaries. What is the function of the ovaries? Is the development of the egg. I said development of the egg inside a follicle which is called the Graafian follicle. So you see here, you can see the primary one. This is the first stage, then the second, then it grows bigger, 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 then it forms a fluid filled space. And somewhere here is this ovum with a few lot of cells in it, which is called the follicle cells. And as it gets bigger and bigger, and then it forms a blister on the surface of the ovary. And then this blister bursts, and this is released. This egg is released where? Into the oviduct. So there would be the oviduct here, and this would be released into the oviduct. So what we have to understand is that the oviduct, I'll just go to another diagram and explain it to you. So the the ovum is released into the oviduct, and this is called ovulation, which is the ejection of the egg from the mature follicle, usually every 28 days. But every 28 days, because you see, what you have to understand, this is one cycle. So 1 day to 28 days, then the second cycle, again the first day of this cycle and the 28 days. So if every 14 days is ovulation, so you know that 14 days means every 28 days. So from here to here, it's every 28 days. Please understand that. So the mature, but what is left behind? You see, the whole thing is not, the whole Graafian follicle is not ejected. Is this part of it is still left? And this part of it then becomes the corpus luteum. And it becomes bigger and bigger, and then finally it starts to disintegrate or degenerate and is broken down. So follicle degenerates, becoming a scar. So this is the function of the ovaries. Please understand that. First, development of the egg, then first the development has to take place, then the ovulation has to take place, and then what is left behind is going to be called the corpus luteum. And what we have to also understand is that when this whole thing is developing, what does it do? The mature follicle then functions as a gland and secreting estrogen. So during this time, when it is developing, it is producing a hormone called estrogen. So the estrogen is produced where? It is produced in the ovary, because this follicle is inside the ovary. So the hormone estrogen is being produced by this follicle, which is this maturing follicle, is going to be producing a hormone estrogen. But then when the ovulation takes place, then after this produces a hormone called progesterone. So both estrogen and progesterone are produced by the ovaries. Both estrogen and progesterone are produced by the ovaries, but at different times of the menstrual cycle. So if we look at the functions of the ovaries, produces the egg cells, or the ovum, produces estrogen and progesterone. And why is estrogen secreted is to thicken the walls of the uterus and also activate the development of other female. Of course, that is a separate story. Progesterone maintains the uterus lining during pregnancy. Now, another diagram showing you the ovary, a very nice diagram. And you can see this is the first stage, we call it the primary follicle. You don't have to know it, but I'm just telling you, see, these are all the initial stages. Let me just color it for you. This is the first stage, then becomes bigger, then it becomes bigger, then it forms a fluid split space, and then it comes to lie on the surface of the ovary, and then it bursts and releases this. So, ruptured follicle. During this time, from here to here, the hormone estrogen is being produced by the ovaries. And then what is left behind is called the corpus luteum. And during this time, then the hormone progesterone is being produced. So estrogen and then progesterone. But then what are the functions of it that we have to understand is how does it act on the lining of the uterus. So the ovaries are producing it, the estrogen and the progesterone, that is entering the blood. The blood is carrying it to the uterus. The uterus is the target organ where they work. Now, I don't expect you to know the names of this, but in order for you to comprehend it or to understand it, I have divided it into two stages. One is called the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle, and then this is the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. Now we're just going to concentrate on what is happening inside the ovary. We're not concentrating on what is happening on the lining. We'll talk about that later on. Now when you look at it, it's day 14 is ovulation. This is the point that everybody needs to remember. Day 14 is ovulation, is the release of the ovum from the surface of the ovary into the oviduct. Before this is the follicle development inside the ovary. So we're just talking about the ovary. We need two hormones here. Number one, we need a hormone estrogen, so that is rising. Plus, we also need another hormone, a very, very important hormone, FSH. So FSH was normal is quite low, but this is slightly increasing. So FSH, which is produced by the pituitary gland, that is increasing. So for the first stage, we need FSH and we need estrogen. Why do we need FSH and estrogen? We want FSH called follicle stimulating hormone. So it is going to cause the development of the follicle inside the ovary. So FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. So follicle stimulating hormone produced by the pituitary is going to work on the ovary and is going to cause the development of the follicle, which contains, of course, the ovum. So meiosis has taken place here, and this ovum has been formed inside here, and this is going to be released. So we need the hormone estrogen and estrogen and FSH, but estrogen is being produced by this follicle. Why? Because it's going to work on the lining of the uterus to repair it. The estrogen is required for the lining of the uterus to repair it. Then for the next stage, the luteal stage, we need a hormone called LH. And you see the LH is 0 or less, is very small in concentration. You can see here the levels here. And then you see it suddenly increasing and then decreasing, and then again it remains less. Now this is called the surge of LH. LH actually helps us in having this ovulation taking place. LH, luteinizing hormone. It results in the development of the corpus luteum. So luteinizing hormone on day 14, it suddenly surges. I mean, it suddenly the concentration in the blood increases to a very high level of 50. The level increase of LH, and that results in ovulation. And please remember, LH is also produced by the pituitary gland. So the pituitary also produces LH, which is called luteinizing hormone. And you can remember it from the corpus luteum. So for the corpus luteum to be formed, you need LH. And then what you understand is once the corpus luteum has been formed, then this corpus luteum produces a hormone called progesterone. So you see the level of progesterone is very low here. And then suddenly after day 14, progesterone levels rise and then remain high and then sort of falls down. So here we did not have any progesterone in this first phase, which is the follicular phase. And we see the level of progesterone increasing after day 14 and then remaining high and then, of course, coming down. So, four hormones we've got to remember: FSH and estrogen here, LH is required here, and then for this stage, we need progesterone. Now, when can fertilization take place? Fertilization can only take place as a window of only 3 to 4 days. The ovum lives for 12 to 24 hours. The sperm lives for 48 to 72 hours. So, in this time, when the ovum is living, that means if it is released on the day 14, then by day 15, 24 hours, and day 16, that is the only time that it can fertilize, because after that it dies. Before that, it has not been produced. After that, it dies. So during this time, the fertilization must take place. So the sperms will enter fallopian tube, penetrate, and fertilize the ovum. So there is a 3 to 4 day window where conception means fertilization, can occur after intercourse. Now, another diagram which I want you to now understand what is happening in the uterus. I did not talk about that earlier. So during this time, the uterus lining is being shed. You see how the thickness is decreasing. And then you see what is happening here. Repair is taking place here. Now for repair, we need the hormone estrogen. And for the follicle, we need the follicle stimulating hormone, which is increasing here. So for the repair of the lining of the uterus, we need the hormone estrogen. Estrogen is produced by the ovary but works on the uterus lining. So this would be the target organ. Now day 14, what has happened? Ovulation has taken place. So you see this sharp increase in progesterone. And what does the progesterone do? It does two things. It maintains the lining. The lining has become a little more thicker. It maintains the lining, and the lining becomes more spongy and vascular. lining of the uterus becomes more spongy and vascular. Why is it more spongy and vascular? Look at all this vascularity, how the capillary network has increased. Why? Because if fertilization has taken place, then the fertilized zygote divides into a ball of cells, and that is going to come and implant here. Implant means it's going to sink in here, and then it's going to grow and develop, and the placenta is going to develop. So, in order, in anticipation or in readiness for the embryo to come and get implanted, this whole story has to take place. I want you to pause the video here and look at it before you listen to what I have to say. Now, the first thing which happens is uterus lining sheds, and this is when we say the period starts, right? Then we have the follicular phase, which is starting from here to here, and then mature egg begins to mature inside the follicle. And then we have ovulation, and the ovulation is the release of the ovum, and the egg is released into the oviduct, and the corpus luteum is formed. So, corpus luteum is formed on day 14, that means ovulation also occurs, and the corpus luteum is also formed. And I can think of an MCQ which would come on this. And then we have the luteal phase, in which the usually lasts 12 to 16 days, and the egg travels down into the fallopian tube. If it is fertilized, fine. If it's not fertilized, it will just die. So, uterus lining sheds, follicular phase, follicle develops inside the ovary, ovulation takes place, corpus luteum is formed, corpus luteum keeps on developing. If sperms were deposited and fertilization take place, then the pregnancy story will start. If not, then we will just have the ovum is released from the into the oviduct, and after 2 days it is going to die. It doesn't mean that one cell is going to die. It's not going to be such a lot of things. All that is reabsorbed into the bloodstream, and it doesn't sort of block the oviduct or something. Some of you imagine weird things happening inside the oviduct. Now let's look at it all together now. Now all together, you see this is now the hormones FSH and LH. This is the graph of that. This is what is happening inside the ovary. This is the ovarian hormone levels. These were the pituitary hormone levels. This is what is happening inside the ovary. This is what is happening to the levels of the ovarian hormones in the blood. We're not going to talk about this. This is something which we don't talk about. So we're only going to be talking of two hormones, estrogen and progesterone. Here we are only going to be talking of FSH and LH. So you need to be looking at these graphs, you need to be drawing these graphs in your copy, and then you have to look what is happening inside the endometrial lining. Endometrial changes during the uterine cycle. So this is the destruction, then we have the repair, and then we have it maintained, and then of course increasing vascularity and making it more spongy and vascular. So the two hormones, estrogen and progesterone, please remember the graphs for it. You can see the graph. Estrogen remains high, then it dips a little, and then it remains a little, but it's lower than before. This is the highest that it comes to here around about the 14th day of the cycle. Then the progesterone hormone is low, 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 low in the first stages. It's very low, and then it rises at day 14, and remains high. Then it goes down. It then again falls. But if pregnancy would take place, then it would remain high, because then progesterone is kept on secreting because the corpus luteum does not degenerate. So the progesterone levels will remain high, and the embryo will implant, and of course then the woman will not have any period, she will not have any menstrual cycles, she will not shed the lining of the uterus for 9 months that she is. There's going to be development of the fetus, and then the baby is born, and then she restarts having the menstrual cycles. Then what is happening inside the ovary? We have the first, in which the follicle is developing, and then we have ovulation, and then of course this is the corpus luteum. So this is the stage in which is also called the luteal stage, or you don't have to know the name of the stage, so it doesn't matter really. And then we have to understand is the hormone FSH. Now this hormone FSH is produced by the pituitary gland. You see this is higher here, and then there's sort of a little increase, and then it remains low. But basically you've got to understand that it is at higher at this point, during this point, which is around about the 7th day. And then you see, what you have to understand is, what you see is the LH LH is a very weird graph, is a very weird hormone. It remains very less in the quantity in the blood, and then suddenly it increases on day 14, and then it immediately drops again. So it's a sort of, we call this the surge, the peak, and then it remains low again. So there's low concentrations in during the whole menstrual cycle, and it's only on day 14. Then you can see this here, day 14 it peaks, and then so day 13 it increases, and day 14 then it of course decreases again. So LH and FSH. LH and FSH are produced by the pituitary gland. Estrogen and progesterone are produced by the ovary, and estrogen is produced by the follicle cells, and progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum. Then a quick comparison of the egg and the sperm. One produced per menstrual cycle, 250 to 280 million per ejaculation, larger diameter in the human body, 50 micrometers smaller, haploid and haploid, both are haploid. Let's not talk about the other things. Mitochondria, 100 to 200, 75 to 100. Special features, there's a zona pellucida, outer glycoprotein coat, and there are cortical granules, enzyme packets within the cell, a tail for propulsion, mitochondria in the middle for energy, and acrosome packet of enzymes in the head. Another thing we have got to understand is sperms are of two types, one carrying the X chromosome and one is carrying the Y chromosome. So out of all these million, half will be the X chromosome sperms and half will be the Y sperms. And whichever one fertilizes will then, of course, determine the gender or the sex of the zygote.